Have you ever wondered what was hidden from you within the Bible itself? Have you ever stopped to think that not everything that was sacred has reached you intact? What if I told you that the name of an African god, yes, a powerful, ancient, and divine name, was erased from the Bible and never mentioned again? Would you believe it? You need to know this. This name existed. It was venerated, invoked, feared. But one day, it disappeared, and it wasn't forgotten by chance. The Bible erased that name, and with it, it also erased the spiritual identity of millions. But why? Who did it? What was the real reason behind this sacred exclusion? And what else might have been removed, modified, or silenced throughout history? You're about to enter one of the most delicate, powerful, and controversial subjects in global spirituality. And this isn't theory, it's fact. The truth is that Africa was the birthplace of incredibly rich spiritual cultures, with complex religious systems, specific divine names, and a profound connection with the invisible. But when these cultures encountered processes of colonization and religious domination, something terrible happened: spiritual erasure. Have you ever noticed that the Bible mentions gods of other cultures? Babylonians, Egyptians, Canaanites, but never an African god by name? Never. Not once. This is no coincidence. Did you grow up believing in an incomplete story? A story that erased the divine origins of an entire people? The exclusion of this name was not just an omission, it was a decision, a strategy, a silencing. And when you take away a god's name, you don't just take away a word. You eliminate the remembrance, the reverence, the connection to the sacred. You disconnect a people from their divine essence. But that silence ends now. In this video, you will discover what this name was, why it was considered dangerous by the writers and translators of the Bible, and how this spiritual erasure affects the consciousness of millions of people to this day. You will no longer ignore this forgotten chapter of faith. You will understand why the Bible never dared to mention that name again. And what's more, you will realize that recovering this name is also recovering part of your own spiritual history. Now tell me, are you ready to see what no one told you? Are you ready to hear the name that has been silenced for centuries? If so, get ready, because in the next moment, we'll dive into the deepest roots of African spirituality, where it all began, and where truth still pulses, even after millennia of silence. And before we delve even deeper into this revelation, I need to ask you something very important. Let us know in the comments what this topic evokes in you. Have you ever heard of it? Do you believe there are other spiritual truths that have been erased from history? Your opinion is a vital part of this conversation. When you comment, you don't just express yourself, you help keep this type of content alive, relevant, and most importantly, accessible to more people who are also seeking the truth. And if what you've heard so far resonated with you, if it stirred your consciousness, if it made you reflect, then leave a like now. This shows YouTube that this topic is important, and it helps the video reach more people. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't repeat what everyone else already says. Here, we investigate, question, and reveal. If you want to continue discovering what's been hidden from you, this is the place for you. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next will make you see African spirituality in a way you may never have imagined. Shall we continue? What few people know, or even imagine, is that long before biblical writing became established as sacred, African peoples already possessed a highly developed spiritual structure, with profound theologies, specific names for their deities, and an understanding of the invisible world that still intrigues researchers and scholars of spirituality. These peoples were not lost or pagan, as many have been taught to believe. They were deeply connected to the spiritual, to the sacred, to what we call God, although they used other names and symbols to refer to this greater force. This is where the truth begins to reveal itself. Africa not only had religion, it was the birthplace of many original forms of spirituality. Peoples such as the Akan, the Yoruba, the Yu, the Dogon, and many others already worshipped the Creator in ways that were later ignored, reinterpreted, or completely erased by the traditions that became dominant. And this didn't happen because these traditions were inferior, but rather because history was told by those who won, and those who won chose what deserved to be remembered and what should be forgotten. Let's look at the names. Nyame. For the Akan people who inhabit the region that is now Ghana, Nyame is the supreme creator, the God who rules the universe, who transcends all things, and who manifests himself through the cosmic order. He is not a minor deity, nor a local mythological figure. Nyame is the Almighty, and yet you will rarely, if ever, hear his name in connection with any biblical or Christian theological study. Why? Olodumare, the supreme god in the Yoruba tradition, is another glaring example. Olodumare is the one who gives the breath of life, the master of destiny, the origin of all that exists in heaven and on earth. No Orisha can act without his permission. He is inaccessible, mysterious, and profound. Many theological scholars have compared Olodumare to the god described in the Old Testament, in his most majestic and untouchable form. However, Olodumare's name never made it into the pages of the Bible. And once again, one must ask, why weren't these names preserved? Why weren't they even mentioned as a historical reference if these cultures already existed before the consolidation of sacred texts? Mawu, the supreme deity of the Yu and Fan people, from the region comprising parts of Togo and Benin, is a creator goddess associated with the moon, motherhood, and universal order. Mawu represents balance, the divine feminine that generates life, cares for, and sustains the world. Alongside Lisa, her male counterpart, Mawu forms a creative unity very similar to concepts of divine duality found in other religions. Yet this vision of a god that embraces the sacred feminine has been ignored, denied, and replaced by an exclusively masculine, patriarchal, and centralizing figure. The question remains, was it omission? Was it contempt? Or was it strategy? And finally, Amma, the supreme god of the Dogons, one of the most mysterious peoples of West Africa, known for their advanced knowledge of astronomy long before modern science. According to the Dogons, Amma created the universe through a primordial word, a divine sound, an idea that connects directly with the biblical concept of, in the beginning was the Word. Yes, the Word made flesh in Christian theology finds deep echoes in Amma, the God who created all things with his sacred vibration. Yet you'll never see this name among traditional theological studies. And this isn't just a gap, it's a wound. These names do not represent lesser gods, as many have been taught to believe. They are not vague mythological entities. They are sacred expressions of the same creator described in the Bible, but with a different cultural and linguistic guise. African spirituality not only believed in a creator god, it had a living relationship with this god, with rituals, chants, oral histories, and practices that kept the flame of the divine alive in the people's daily lives. The question you need to ask yourself now is, how is it possible that names so important, so divine, so connected to the sacred, have been completely erased from a book that purports to tell the story of the relationship between God and humanity? Could the problem be the names themselves, or their origin? Were these names eliminated because of their spiritual power or because of their color? The truth is harsh, but it must be said. When Christianity began to expand, especially in regions dominated by European empires, there was a clear need to disconnect colonized peoples from their spiritual roots. And this inevitably included severing their connection with their gods, their sacred names, their forms of prayer, and their connection with the divine. It was easier to dominate a people who had lost awareness of their own God. And that's what happened. African spirituality, with its ancestral gods, was not fought with words alone. It was fought with fire, blood, slavery, and erasure. Their names were replaced by Lord, by Most High, by generic words that, while pointing to the same essence, no longer carried the spiritual memory of the people who once said, Nyame, Olodumare, Mawu, Amma. And so, the Creator was redesigned, and the people were disconnected. But now that you know these names, now that you've heard these truths, can you ignore them? Can you look at the Bible with the same eyes, knowing that divine names have been eliminated from official history? And furthermore, is there something sacred in reclaiming these names? In speaking about them? In giving voice to what has been silenced? It's not just a matter of information. It's a matter of spiritual identity. Because if the faith you received began with silence, perhaps healing begins with remembrance. Now I want to know, were you already familiar with any of these names? Had you ever heard of Nyame, Olodumare, Mawu, or Amma? Tell me in the comments. If one of these deities touched your heart in any way, write their name below. Say, I recognize Nyame, or Olodumare still lives. This simple gesture is already an act of resistance, a spiritual act of remembrance. And of course, comment on what you think so far, whether this content helps you see beyond, reflect, or question what was presented as absolute truth. Your comment helps this video reach others who also need to reconnect with something that was ripped from its roots. If you're with me this far, it's because something inside you recognizes that the story you were told is incomplete, and what comes next will show you exactly how this spiritual erasure was accomplished and who benefited from it. Now that you've learned these names, Nyame, Olodumare, Mawu, Amma, and understand the spiritual weight each carries, the question that can't be avoided is, at what point and by what means did the Bible begin to ignore these deities? How could a book that purports to tell the story of humanity and its connection to the Creator manage to override entire civilizations, erasing their names, their practices, their expressions of faith? This exclusion was not random. It was not innocent. It was the result of a long and calculated process of substitution, which began with the first translations of sacred texts. A process we can safely call spiritual colonization, something as destructive as territorial and cultural colonization. Because while the sword dominated bodies, the pen and theology rewrote souls. When biblical texts began to circulate in languages such as Hebrew, Greek, and later Latin, there was a strong desire to centralize the divinity under a single name, a single form, a single language, compatible with the religious and political agenda of the powers of the time. It was in this context that the names of gods outside the dominant culture, especially those of African origin, began to be completely ignored or diluted with generic translations such as Lord, Most High, God, or simply Elohim. Have you ever stopped to reflect on the power of naming something? A name is not just a word. It carries essence, memory, presence. When a sacred name is removed from a text, the spirit that inhabited it is removed. The energy that name invoked slowly fades from the collective consciousness, and that's exactly what happened. The name was erased, and with it, the path back to it, for millions of people, was also erased. The replacement of ancestral names with generic titles in the Bible may seem like a mere stylistic or linguistic choice, but it isn't. It was a political, theological, and colonizing move. By transforming all sacred names into a single term, the Bible translators erased the clues that connected indigenous peoples, such as Africans, to the divine source. And without these clues, there was only one path left: to accept the imposed faith as absolute truth while their own spiritual roots were labeled heresy, paganism, or idolatry. This becomes even clearer when we consider how the term Lord came to dominate Scripture. Have you ever noticed how, in most Bible translations, the word Lord appears in capital letters as an attempt to universalize a name that originally had very specific roots? This substitution not only nullified the multiplicity of divine names present in other cultures, but also centralized the sacred in a European language, alienating millions of people from their own legitimate ways of connecting with God. Spiritual colonization operated silently but devastatingly. Where there had been chants to Mawu, people began to sing to a faceless Lord, with no origins, no history that connected with the African experience. Where praise was offered to Olodumare in sacred rituals, people began to fear a God who punished and demanded blind obedience. The figure of the divine, once plural, welcoming, and deeply connected to nature, ancestry, and the cycles of life, was transformed into a European idol, white, masculine, and distant. And this erasure didn't just occur in language, it extended to theology, rituals, art, temples, dances, clothing, and colors. Everything that evoked African spirituality came to be considered profane, demonic, and undesirable. And so, many peoples were forced to abandon not only their names for God, but also their ways of praying, singing, celebrating, and existing in communion with the sacred. This interference was so profound that, to this day, there are Black people who feel disconnected from God, unaware that the Creator they seek was already invoked by their ancestors, with names that have been erased. Many grew up hearing that the faith they had access to was the only true one, while their entire spiritual heritage was considered cursed. This created a chasm of spiritual identity that echoes to this day in churches, families, and consciences. And I know this can be uncomfortable to hear. It may even seem like an affront to the faith many have grown to love. But the intention here is not to attack the Bible. It's not to diminish what it represents. It's to illuminate what has been hidden within it. It's to understand that behind many of its passages there are glaring silences. Silences that cover names, stories, and wisdom that have been marginalized because they don't fit into the dominant model of spirituality. Because when history is written only by those who won, it doesn't tell the whole story. It tells what matters. And what mattered at that time was the centralization of spiritual power, delegitimizing all other forms of connection with the divine that weren't sanctioned by the great empires and their religious structures. You need to understand, African faith was no less true. It simply didn't fit into the colonizing nation's plan to expand their power, and so it was labeled superstition. That's why its names were changed. That's why its memory was silenced. But she didn't disappear. She remained alive deep within the soul of a people. She survived in the songs of the toreros, in the stories told by elders, in the prayers whispered by mothers, in the instinctive gestures that repeat themselves even without knowing why. She is in you, in me, in all of us who carry African blood and seek a true connection with the Creator. Biblical interference, therefore, is not just a matter of translation. It is a matter of power. It is the story of how one name was replaced by another, how one faith was superseded by another, how a truth was stifled until it almost disappeared. But if she has reached you now, it is because she is ready to be remembered. Do you still remember the name? Do you still feel the presence of Nyame, Olodumare, Mawu, Amma? If so, comment below. Say, I recognize the sacred names that have been erased, or simply write the name that touched your heart the most. This isn't just a comment, it's a spiritual act. It's a form of resistance, of remembrance, of reconnection. And of course, tell me, have you ever heard about the replacement of these names in the Bible? Did this content make you see something you've never been told? Tell me in the comments. Let's transform this space into a meeting point between memory and revelation. When we think of the idea of a name erased from the Bible, many imagine something symbolic, a simple detail, or perhaps an exaggeration. But what if I told you that this name really existed, was sacred, was invoked, and was removed intentionally? We're talking not just about a forgotten word, but about a powerful African deity, known, feared, and revered by its children for generations, long before the colonizers imposed their versions of faith. His name is Nzambi Mpungu. Have you heard this name before? If not, know that it was one of the oldest ways of referring to the supreme creator in the region that now comprises parts of Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Gabon. Nzambi Mpungu was the Most High God of the Bakongo people, the supreme being, invisible, omnipresent, creator of heaven, earth, life, and destiny. He was the God no one saw, but everyone knew was there, sustaining everything. Nzambi was not an intermediary deity like the Orishas or Voduns. No, he was the direct equivalent of what Christian theology defines as Almighty God, but with one crucial difference. He had a name. He had a cultural identity. He spoke the language of his children and responded to their rituals. Nzambi was close. He was memory. He was heritage. He was a living spirit in the songs and prayers of the ancestors. And this name, powerful as it was, did not survive the pages of the Bible. Why? Because he was African. Like Olodumare, Nyame, Amma, and Mawu, Nzambi was rendered invisible within the sacred text. And this wasn't simply because the biblical translators were unaware of his existence. The truth is, Nzambi was known and was deliberately ignored. There are historical accounts of 16th century Portuguese missionaries who arrived in the Congo region and were astonished to discover that the local people already possessed a concept of a single God, creator of all, very similar to the Christian God. One of the most famous missionaries, Father Giovanni Cavazzi, described the Bakongo as a people who already spoke of God before even hearing the gospel. That was a threat, because the missionary project wasn't just about evangelizing, it was about cultural domination. And how could you convince a people to accept a new God if they already worshiped the same one, under a different name? How could you claim they were in error if they already praised an invisible, just, spiritual, and all-powerful creator? The answer was clear. Suppress that name. Silence that deity. Rewrite history as if it all began with the arrival of the colonizers. And so, Nzambi Mpungu was erased. But the name endured. He endured in oral tradition. He endured in songs. He endured in the spiritual practices of quilombos, toreros, and secret gatherings where descendants of Africans kept alive the memory of the divine that their ancestors knew. Nzambi is still invoked in several traditional African and Afro-descendant communities, but his name is rarely mentioned in official theological studies and practically never appears in biblical debates. He is treated as if he never existed, and that is where the true erasure lies. Imagine what this means. A people who already had a direct connection with the Creator are forced to deny that connection to accept a new path, presented as the only true one. A sacred name, full of history and spiritual presence, being replaced by a generic title. And the saddest part, this replacement happened not only outside the Bible, but in people's hearts. Gradually, Nzambi became taboo. Its mention was avoided. Many began to associate the name with forbidden, non-Christian religions. And with that, a spiritual bond was severed. The religious identity of thousands of Africans and their descendants was replaced by a new narrative, one that did not include them as protagonists of faith, but as supporting actors in a story written by others. Can you feel the weight of it? Nzambi Mpungu's name was not removed by chance. It was erased because, if it had been present in the Bible, it would have forced the Christian world to recognize that Africans were not in spiritual darkness, as the colonizers claimed, but rather that they had already walked with the divine long before the arrival of the missionaries. This would have changed the entire structure of the doctrine as it was taught, and so the name had to disappear. But the time of silence is over. Nzambi is being remembered. And with him comes the collective memory of a people who have always had a connection with the sacred, even if official history has tried to deny it. And I know you may be hearing this name for the first time. It may seem strange, distant, but I invite you to go beyond the strangeness, because sometimes what was violently taken from you is precisely what can heal your soul. Nzambi represents more than an African deity. He represents spiritual reparation, reconnection with one's roots, and the recovery of a lost link. And when you speak this name, you are activating memories that have lain dormant within you for generations. Perhaps now you're beginning to understand why this name was erased. Because it carries a power that could not be controlled. Because it is a bridge between the Creator and the African people. And this bridge needed to be destroyed so that a new doctrine could be imposed. But it wasn't destroyed completely. It was simply hidden. And now, it is being rebuilt. So tell me, have you ever heard of Nzambi Mpungu? Did that name resonate with you? If so, write in the comments, Nzambi still lives, or I recognize the God of my ancestors. And if this content is opening your eyes to a truth that was denied to you, say so too. It could be with a simple phrase, I'm waking up spiritually. The important thing is that you participate. Because your comment, besides helping with engagement, is also a cry for remembrance. It's you placing yourself as part of a history that they tried to erase, but failed. Now that you've heard the name Nzambi Mpungu, that you understand its spiritual weight, its ancestral presence, and the pain that accompanies its erasure, the inevitable question is, how exactly did this happen? How was a name that was so sacred to an entire people erased from the world's spiritual history? And why was this decision accepted, reproduced, and even defended by so many over the centuries? The truth is that the erasure of Nzambi, and so many other African spiritual expressions, didn't happen in a single act. It was a process, cold, slow, strategic, a process meticulously constructed over centuries through powerful tools such as theology, politics, colonization, and above all, the standardization of Scripture. Yes, it passed through many hands, translated, edited, adapted, and shaped according to the interests of each era. And at many of these decisive moments, names were removed, terms were changed, symbols were remodeled, all in the name of doctrinal unity, religious authority, and above all, the construction of a centralized spiritual empire. One of the most obvious milestones in this process was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when religious and political leaders gathered to determine which books would be considered inspired by God and which would be rejected. Now stop and think. A group of men decided, by vote, which parts of humanity's spiritual history should or should not be preserved. And do you really think they chose to preserve what African people and their ancient traditions valued? Of course. They chose to exclude everything that didn't fit into the power structure being constructed. Books with Gnostic influences, texts that extolled ancestral wisdom, passages that suggested divine plurality, or that spoke of revelations in uncivilized lands were systematically eliminated. And in this process, names like Nzambi, Olodumare, Mawu, and others disappeared from the official narrative. They were suppressed not because they were irrelevant, but because they were dangerous to the project of spiritual uniformity. And when I say spiritual standardization, I mean exactly what it sounds like, transforming the Creator into a single, exclusive concept with a specific language under the control of a centralized hierarchical religious structure, a standardized God accessible only through official intermediaries, priests, pastors, bishops, missionaries, all trained within a European logic of spirituality. Now imagine how this affects people who had a living, direct, and ancestral relationship with the sacred. People who, for centuries, invoked their gods by name, felt their presence in the forests, in the rivers, in the mountains, in the fire. People who didn't need temples with golden domes to connect with the Creator, because they knew that He also lived in the leaves, in the waters, in the stars. These people were considered primitive, ignorant, and lost, but they weren't. What they had was something frightening: spiritual autonomy. They didn't depend on books, dogma, or religious authorities, and this posed a risk. A spiritually autonomous people is a free people, and a free people doesn't submit easily. Therefore, spiritual colonization became a fundamental weapon of the colonial project. When Europeans invaded Africa, they didn't just bring swords and chains, they also took the Bible. And the Bible, in that context, wasn't just a sacred book. It was a manual for spiritual domestication, an instrument of forced conversion, where the Creator needed to be given a new name, a new image, a new color, a new language, and most importantly, a new structure of authority. Nzambi had no place in this new arrangement. Because he was African, he spoke the language of the people. He didn't obey the church hierarchy. He didn't ask for tithes. He didn't live in stone castles. He was wind, he was shade, he was heat in the middle of the forest. He was free, and that was unacceptable. Then came the censorship. Not an explicit censorship like a decree saying, "Don't speak that name anymore," but a symbolic, cultural, pedagogical censorship. For centuries, African children were taught that their gods were false, that their dances were of the devil, that their rituals were sinful, that their sacred names were cursed. And with each new generation that grew up disconnected from their original spirituality, the structure of domination became stronger. The erasure was so profound that, today, many still feel guilty just hearing these names. Some feel fear upon hearing Nzambi, as if it were something forbidden, impure, dangerous. But dangerous for whom? For the system that benefits from oblivion? For the religious structure that strengthens itself on the spiritual amnesia of the people? Nzambi wasn't erased for lack of importance. He was erased because remembering him is an act of liberation. Because remembering the name that was censored is also remembering who you were before you were taught to hate yourself. Before you were convinced that God spoke only one language, had only one face, and accepted only one form of worship. And if this is starting to make sense to you, it's because your spiritual memory is awakening. You're breaking through the veil of manipulation and lies. You're remembering, and that remembrance has power. Now that you understand how and why this name was removed, you might be wondering what to do with this information, how to react to all of this, how to position yourself in the face of this truth that has no place in churches or theological seminaries. But before we move on to this profound reflection, tell me, have you ever felt something was missing in your spirituality? That your faith had a void that couldn't be explained by verses? Then comment below, "I'm reconnecting," or "Now I understand what I was missing." Your comment could be the beginning of a journey for someone watching this video for the first time and feeling, deep down, that this message is for them too. When we begin to understand the mechanisms that erased Nzambi's name, that censored the African sacred, that distorted the spiritual memory of Black people, a new question arises forcefully. After all, what is the Bible really? Is it a purely spiritual document, a divine revelation delivered directly to human beings? Or was it also, and still is, a political instrument used to shape behavior, control the masses, and justify power structures? This question is uncomfortable because it touches on everything many of us have learned to respect without question. From a young age, we were taught to see the Bible as absolute truth, as if it had descended from heaven, written by the hand of God. But that's not how it was. The Bible was written by people with beliefs, intentions, ideologies, and human limitations. People who lived in specific historical contexts, under specific cultural, political, and religious pressures. And this needs to be acknowledged with maturity and courage. This isn't about disrespecting the Bible. Quite the opposite. It's about honoring it for what it truly is. A sacred text, yes, but also a text constructed over time, edited, selected, and shaped by human hands. And, like all human texts, it carries both divine inspiration and political influence. Think with me. Why were certain texts chosen to compose the Bible and others discarded? Who decided this? What was the criterion? Have you ever wondered why some Gospels were considered canonical, and others, such as the Gospel of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, or Enoch, were considered heretical or dangerous? What exactly made one text worthy of being God's word and another not? The answer lies in politics. Because what was at stake was not just spiritual purity, but the construction of a unified and controllable belief system. It was necessary to create an official narrative, a central doctrine, a manual of faith that left no room for interpretations that granted people too much spiritual autonomy. And this necessarily meant controlling memory, standardizing discourse, and eliminating what didn't fit. When we look at the councils, at the great theological decisions that defined the course of Christianity, we realize that many of the arguments used were not exclusively spiritual. They were political, strategic. The questions guiding these decisions were not just, is this true, but also, does this strengthen our authority? Does this unify the empire? Does this allow us to better control people's faith? And it is at this point that we understand why Nzambi's name, like so many other elements of African spirituality, had no place. It was not in the religious leaders' interest at that time to allow Africans to remain connected to their ancestral God. It was more convenient to erase, replace, and indoctrinate, and so it was done. The Bible we have today is the result of this process, a process that involved selection, editing, translation, and even censorship, a process in which true, living, popular, and ancestral spirituality was, at times, pushed aside to make way for a controlled, institutional, and hierarchical spirituality. Have you ever noticed how the Bible has been used historically to justify practices that we now recognize as utterly unjust? Slavery, for example, was sustained based on biblical verses for centuries. Entire peoples were subjugated with the Bible in one hand and the whip in the other. This is not an invention. It's documented. Missionaries taught servile obedience to enslaved people using sacred texts. And this was done in the name of God. And it doesn't stop there. Machismo, colonialism, religious intolerance, all of these have found support in certain historical contexts within biblical interpretations. And all of this leads us to understand that the Bible was used, and still is used, as a tool of power. This doesn't negate its spiritual dimension, but it demands a new stance from us, one of questioning, of interpreting, of returning to our origins, one of listening to the silences, because what the Bible reveals is as important as what it hides. And many of the truths that have been erased, like Nzambi's name, like black spirituality, like the sacred feminine, continue to pulsate, waiting to be rescued. Many serious scholars, biblical archaeologists, and critical theologians have been showing for decades that sacred texts were heavily influenced by the historical contexts in which they were written, that certain passages were inserted to serve political needs, that translations were biased, that interpretations were shaped to serve institutional agendas. And when you look at the Bible through this lens, not to discredit it, but to understand its complexity, something powerful happens. You begin to distinguish the divine from the manipulative. You begin to realize that God is not bound by a text, that the Spirit is not limited to a book, that the divine presence is far greater than what has been allowed into the sacred canon, and that what has been excluded, the names, the myths, the stories, the songs, the dances, the African rituals, perhaps also carry profound revelations about the Creator. This awakening is uncomfortable, I know, because it forces us to reevaluate everything, to rebuild our faith, to leave the comfortable path of blind obedience and enter the sacred terrain of conscious seeking. But it is also liberating, because it restores something that was taken from us, the right to access the divine through our own roots. The Bible can be a source of light, yes, but it has also been used as an instrument of shadow. It contains wisdom, but also omissions. It reveals, but also conceals. And that is why we need to read it with an open heart, attentive eyes, and feet firmly planted on the ground of our ancestry. Because only then will we be able to distinguish between revelation and manipulation. Now tell me, does this make sense to you? Have you ever felt there was something behind what you were taught as absolute truth? Have you ever suspected that your spirituality was being shaped not only by God, but by human interests? Then comment below, "I'm seeing beyond the text," or write what you felt after hearing all this. Your comment helps this content reach more people who, like you, are awakening to a deeper, freer, truer faith. If you've been able to perceive how much Nzambi's name has been erased, silenced, and replaced, now is the time to take an even deeper step. Because this isn't just a historical or theological issue. It's a spiritual and existential issue. Because when you take away the name of their God from a people, you're not just changing words. You're breaking bonds. You're burning spiritual bridges. You're destroying an identity that has been built generation after generation. And this doesn't go unpunished. There are consequences, real consequences, which we feel to this day, even without naming them. One of the most serious is the imposed spiritual disconnection that millions of African descendants carry without even knowing it. It's that feeling of spiritual orphanhood that can't be explained, that sensation that the faith taught doesn't fully represent you, that void that no cult fills, no doctrine answers, because the root of your soul has been severed or attempted to be severed. Have you ever felt this? This absence is not due to a lack of God. The Creator never abandoned us. The problem is that for too long, we were taught to seek Him in a place where He never spoke to us in our language. We were led to worship a God who didn't resemble us, who didn't carry our symbols, who didn't know our stories. We were made to believe that to be saved, we had to deny everything we were: our names, our rhythms, our dances, our rituals, our ancestors, our orishas, our vodans, our Nkaisis, and most cruel of all, our God. And herein lies the profound impact of this erasure. We lost our sense of who we are spiritually. We grew up believing that God was elsewhere, with other people, with a different appearance, and this planted a corrosive doubt in us. Do I truly belong to this God? Am I accepted as I am? Or do I need to conform to an image that has nothing to do with me to be loved by Him? This is why so many Black people, even today, struggle to feel spiritually worthy. They carry guilt for expressing their ancestry. They are afraid to seek their spiritual roots. They were taught that everything that came from Africa was impure, dangerous, and inferior. And this created a rupture that goes far beyond religion. It is a rupture in the soul. Because spirituality isn't just what you believe. It's how you see yourself within the cosmos. It's the sense of belonging to the divine. It's the recognition that your existence has a sacred purpose. And when this is removed, erased, replaced, what's left is confusion, spiritual dependence, fear, and guilt. Exactly what has been implanted over the centuries in the minds of African descendants. But don't think this was a mistake. It was a strategy. Preventing a people from accessing their original spirituality is the most effective way to disarm them. Because a spiritually disconnected people is a manipulable people. They no longer have an inner compass. They constantly seek external approval. They accept impositions more easily because they no longer believe in their own ancestral wisdom. And herein lies the most painful implication. The faith of many African descendants today is still based on self-denial. They pray, sing, worship, but with the feeling that they need to erase something within themselves to be accepted. How many have heard phrases like, "You need to renounce your ancestry, abandon your culture, let go of the past, don't look back"? But how can one be spiritually fulfilled if they must sever their own roots to please a God who should be their father? This imposed spiritual disconnect manifests itself in many forms: in unexplainable depression, in a sense of emptiness in churches, in identity crises, in young Black men who see no beauty in their history, in mothers who pray, afraid to invoke their ancestors, in men who feel weak for revering the divine, and other expressions. All of this is a symptom of a profound rupture between the self and the sacred. And if you've made it this far in this video, perhaps you're beginning to realize this. Perhaps you're feeling that some of this pain is yours too. Perhaps you're understanding that this content isn't just an intellectual revelation. It's a wake-up call for your spirit. Because despite all this erasure, there is something that has never been destroyed. The divine spark within you. That which connects you to Nzambi, to Olodumare, to Mawu, to Ama. It is still there, waiting to be remembered. No matter how much they have tried to silence your soul, you still carry the seal of the Creator within you. And recognizing this is the first step to freeing yourself from imposed spirituality and walking again with your feet firmly on the ground of your origin. The biggest implication of all this is that you can and must reconnect. Not to reject everything you've been taught, but to embrace what has been denied you, to heal this internal division, to understand that the God you seek may be much closer than you imagine, and that He has your face, speaks your language, understands your pain, and honors your ancestors. And when this reconnection happens, everything changes. You pray with more truth. You sing with more soul. You feel like you're part of the sacred, not a piece out of place. You no longer need to hide behind religious masks. You can be whole, complete, at peace. That's why this video exists. It's not to confront your faith. It's to help you rediscover it. Not the one you were told was the only one possible, but the one that springs from your blood, your history, your divine heritage. Because yes, you have a spiritual identity, and it begins when you recognize that it was God who made you black, and that is sacred. So tell me below, have you ever felt something was missing in your spirituality? That there was a hole that no pastor, priest, or book could fill? If so, comment, "I am reconnecting with my roots," or "I am a child of the God who dwells within me." These phrases are seeds you plant not only in the comments, but in your own consciousness. If you thought the erasure of Nzambi Mpungu was an isolated incident, perhaps even rare or specific to African spirituality, you need to know that the story is much broader, and at the same time, more painful. What they did to Nzambi was not an accident, much less a one-off act. It was part of a pattern, a systematic practice that spanned centuries and civilizations, that persecuted spiritual diversity in the name of religious standardization, and that was repeated time and again against other sacred figures who also carried their own light. To understand this, we need to look beyond Africa and also to the Middle East, Mesopotamia, the Hebrew lands, and the ancient peoples who, long before the formation of the Bible as we know it today, already worshipped deities, cosmic forces, and spiritual entities that would later be completely erased from official religious records. And the first we need to talk about is Asherah. Few people know, but in the most ancient times of the Hebrew faith, Asherah was considered a powerful female deity, often described as the consort of Yahweh, the God of Israel himself. She appeared in rituals, altars, and even archaeological inscriptions that clearly show that the Hebrew people, especially before the Babylonian exile, recognized her presence. But over time, as monotheism became more rigidly structured, there was no longer room for the sacred feminine alongside the one masculine God. And so, Asherah was removed, demonized, erased. The name that once represented fertility, wisdom, and the spiritual nourishment of the Divine Mother began to be treated as a symbol of idolatry. Records mentioning her were deleted, artifacts destroyed or reinterpreted. The Bible begins to portray Asherah as something that needs to be combated, removed from temples, forgotten. The same pattern, erasure, replacement, silence. Another striking example is Lilith. Today, her name is surrounded by myths and distortions, and is almost always associated with negative ideas, as if she were a demonic figure. But in the oldest traditions, Lilith represented feminine independence, creative force, the mystery of the night, and sacred sensuality. She was an archetype that challenged the submission imposed on women, and over time was transformed into a feared figure. The narrative that Lilith was Adam's first wife, who refused to submit to him and was therefore expelled from Eden, illustrates the discomfort that religious patriarchy has always had with women who thought for themselves. Lilith, like Asherah, was pushed into the shadows. Everything that represented feminine spiritual autonomy was labeled dangerous. Thus, what could have been a source of spiritual balance, the divine feminine, was silenced. And what was left? A single masculine god with punitive, hierarchical, demanding, and distant characteristics. The harmony of opposites, the energetic completeness of creation, was shattered. The result of this resonates to this day in the way the spiritual world still treats the feminine with suspicion, and the examples continue. Let's go back to ancient Sumer. One of the oldest gods recorded by humanity was called Enki. He was the god of waters, wisdom, knowledge, and fertility. Enki was seen as a divine being who favored humanity, who brought solutions, who mediated cosmic conflicts, and who bestowed gifts upon humanity. He appears in the records of the Sumerian civilization long before Abraham, long before the biblical texts. But when the religious narratives of Mesopotamia were replaced by those of the Semitic world, and then by Abrahamic traditions, Enki disappeared. It disappeared from official texts. It disappeared from cultural memory. The remaining elements of it were distorted, assimilated into other figures, or simply ignored. What represented fluid wisdom and spirituality connected to nature was replaced by dogmas, rules, and increasingly closed systems. And once again, we see the same pattern. Deities that offered a direct connection to the sacred, without institutional religious mediation, were erased. Are you realizing what this reveals? These cases show that Nzambi's erasure is not an isolated incident. It is part of a logic that has been repeated across countless cultures and civilizations. A logic whose central objective is to disconnect ordinary people from their original spirituality and, in its place, to insert a controlled, hierarchical, and power-driven religious structure. And what do all these sacred figures have in common? They all, in some way, represented spiritual freedom, autonomy, and connection with the divine outside the walls of organized religion. And that's why they needed to be silenced. It's no coincidence that so many female figures have been erased. It's no coincidence that deities linked to nature have been demonized. It's no accident that black gods, like Nzambi, have disappeared from scripture. All of this is part of the same script, a script that aimed to build a single path to God, the authorized official path, approved by those in power. And if you pay attention, you'll notice that this pattern continues to operate today. Even today, there's resistance when it comes to African spirituality. Even today, there's rejection of names like Asherah, Lilith, and Enki. Even today, there's fear when Nzambi is mentioned. This isn't without reason. It's the result of centuries of spiritual programming that has distanced us from ourselves, from our roots, from our sacredness. But when you start to remember, something awakens. You begin to understand that perhaps it's not your heart that's wrong, but the story you've been told. That your spiritual sensitivity isn't heresy, but memory. That your intuition isn't rebellion, it's reconnection. And that perhaps the names you didn't know before, Nzambi, Asherah, Lilith, Enki, aren't monsters or myths, but living parts of what was ripped from your spiritual heritage. And that's why you're here. Because inside you, even if silently, there's always been a question. Why does my faith feel incomplete? Perhaps now, with these examples, you'll realize that your faith isn't weak. It's just wounded, and it will only be healed when you accept the truth. The sacred is greater than what you've been allowed to see. If you felt this way, comment below, "I'm remembering who I am." Or, write the name of one of these figures that most touched your spirit. Nzambi still lives. Lilith was silenced, but resists. Asherah is my sacred memory. Your comments are much more than words. They are living testimonies of a people who are awakening spiritually. What if all your life you've been searching for a connection with God, with the Creator, with the Almighty, but without knowing that this connection had existed for generations and was simply interrupted? Pause. Breathe. Now listen to me carefully. What if the God your ancestors worshipped was also the creator of heaven and earth? What if this God had a name, a history, walked with his people, heard their prayers, answered their cries, and knew you, even before you were born? What if, over the centuries, this name was erased from books, replaced by generic titles, hidden by translations, ignored by theologies, but never ceased to exist? This seemingly simple question is one of the most powerful you can ask yourself, because it has the potential to completely turn your spiritual wheel. It can make you realize that perhaps you were never as far from God as you thought. You were simply disconnected from your own spiritual roots. Since childhood, Many of us have been taught to believe that everything began with the Bible, that before it there was ignorance, sin, and darkness, that our ancestors were lost, and that only after the arrival of the gospel did we begin to know the truth. But what if it's just the opposite? What if they already knew the Creator? They just called him by another name. What if what you were taught to reject as paganism was actually an ancient and legitimate form of spirituality? It's not about denying what you've learned, nor about throwing away your faith history. It's not about choosing between one thing or another. It's about integration, reconciliation, truth. It's about recognizing that the Creator is too great to fit into a single culture, a single language, a single doctrine, and even more. It's about allowing the divine to return to dwell within your history, your color, your ancestry. Because if the God who created everything is truly omnipresent, then he was also present in Africa. He was present in the rituals of the Bantu, Yoruba, Fon, Ewe, and Ashanti peoples. He was present in the prayers that rose from the toreros, the villages, the sacred forests. The same God who revealed himself in Israel also revealed himself in Nzambi, in Olodumare, in Mawu, in Amma, but the name was what they erased. The bond was what they tried to sever. The inherited faith, the one that came with the colonizers, was implanted as if it were the only possible one, and the ancestral faith was condemned to oblivion. And what did this cause? It has caused a fragmented spirituality, a faith that is often based on fear, denial, and repression, a feeling that one must stop being who one is to be accepted by God, a faith that doesn't embrace history, but rejects it, that doesn't honor ancestors, but curses them, that doesn't recognize the beauty of one's own people, but tries to imitate them in other ways. And this sickens the soul. Yes, the soul becomes ill when it is forced to forget where it came from, when it is taught to suppress its own spiritual voice, when it is indoctrinated into believing that the sacred only exists externally, that the divine speaks only one language, that the path to God necessarily passes through a tradition that excludes its origin. But at this moment, you have a choice. You can keep repeating this story you've been told, or you can stop and ask yourself, what is the story that lives within me? What is the spiritual truth that vibrates in my blood, in my bones, in my deepest memories? What do I feel when I hear names like Nzambi Mpungu, Olodumare, Ashara? Are these names truly false? Or is it the silence that surrounds them that is false? This reflection isn't about changing religions, nor about adopting new beliefs out of fashion or rebellion. It's about listening to the call of your soul, that part of you that has been stifled for so long, that never felt fully included in the narratives offered to you, that even in the midst of worship still felt empty, not because there was no faith, but because there was a lack of belonging. And perhaps it is now that this belonging begins to return, when you allow yourself to look back, not with guilt, but with honor, when you stop calling wrong what your ancestors called sacred, when you understand that the Creator is greater than the structure they tried to impose, and that He continues to call you by the name they gave you back then, before colonization, before baptism, before translations. Inherited faith has value, but it's not enough when it ignores ancestral faith, and that's where spiritual reconciliation comes in. The point where you no longer have to choose between what you learned in childhood and what pulses within you now. You can honor both, as long as you have the courage to see with your own eyes and feel with your own spirit. Ancestral faith is not a threat. It is a return, a reunion, a realignment, a path back to the sacred that has always been yours, but which has been hidden. When you recognize this, something changes within you. Worship ceases to be an effort to please. Prayer ceases to be a desperate plea. And contact with God becomes a natural, intimate, fluid conversation, as it was in the beginning, between Creator and creature, without intermediaries, without masks, without censorship. You begin to walk more firmly, more clearly, with more purpose, because now you know where you came from. You understand who you are, and this awareness puts you in a different place in life. You no longer need to prove your spiritual worth. You live from it. So take a deep breath and answer me. What if the God of your ancestors was always the true Creator, and you just didn't know it? What changes? What does this reveal to you about everything you were taught? What does this awaken within your spirit? If this video reached you at a time when these questions were already being asked, comment below, "My soul is awakening," or "I'm reconciling with my spiritual ancestry." Write in your own words too, if you'd like. What are you feeling now? How does this make you rethink your journey of faith? If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has awakened, and that already says a lot about who you are and about your spiritual journey. So do this. Subscribe to the channel now, because here we will continue to unveil the truths that you were taught to forget and rebuild together a free, profound spirituality connected to our roots. Leave a like, because it lets YouTube know this content matters. And if this message really resonates with you, comment below, "I made it to the end because I'm ready to remember who I am." And if you want, you can also add, "Nzambi still lives." These words are more than phrases. They are spiritual declarations. And now, to continue this journey, click on the next video that appears here on the screen. What you'll discover there may be exactly what was missing to complete what we started today. See you next time. Akse.